I'm so happy to have you joining me in my studio today for a chat about paint. I get a lot of questions about what paint I use, and I thought it would be good to talk about it here. I know when I was first starting out, I really wanted to know what was the best paint to use. From my experience, if you're using really high quality paints and you're just starting out, you'll be less frustrated. One of the things about lower quality paints is that they have less pigment, so the colors are not going to be quite as intense just as you use them. You could layer the paint to get a more intense, darker color, but when you're just starting out, that can be a little tricky. So I have a few different brands here I wanted to talk about, and all of these are pan watercolors. I prefer working with pan watercolors. I have worked that way almost the entire time I've been working with watercolor. I did start out inheriting a couple sets of tubes, and the thing about watercolor and tubes, after it sits around for a while, the pigments and the binders and the liquid can separate. And so you squirt it onto your palette. If it's not mixed together, you get kind of a mess and it's really difficult to use. Also, unless the cap is screwed on entirely, completely, tightly, you run the risk of your paints drying in the tubes. The longevity of paint in pans, I think, is pretty much indefinite. You can just keep using it again and again and again until you run out. Use what you most feel comfortable with. I love the pans. You can also create your own pans. They sell little plastic inserts for palette cases that you can fill with paint and use again and again. So that's another option. This is the first professional set that I purchased. It's Sennelier, and I have swapped out some of the colors and actually lost one of the pans on vacation one time. I've gone through a lot of yellow, so I've replaced those a couple times. Yellow I use a lot for mixing greens and for oranges, so that's one of the reasons I go through a lot of yellow. This is a really high quality French manufacturer, and their paint, they have a really fun video of how their paint is made that I can link to below. I've really enjoyed using them, and for a while they were my favorite. Winsor & Newton is another brand that I use, and this case actually came with a set of their Cotman watercolors that I first started using when I was beginning to paint. And Cotman is their student line. I didn't really like the Cotman watercolors very much, and I have since replaced the paints in this case with their professional watercolors, which I do like a lot. Probably the paints that I use the most, I mix all of these together, so there's not necessarily a brand that I like the best, although I would say the Yarka St. Petersburg paints, which I first started purchasing one pan at a time. They sell their paints as full pans. The paints in these two other cases are half pans. The Yarka St. Petersburg, they're from Russia. They are much less expensive than either Sennelier or Winsor & Newton, and the pigments are very intense, and I enjoy working with them. There are a few colors that they produce that I haven't been able to find elsewhere, and actually next week I'll talk about one of those, my favorite color. So this case, I've found it's difficult to find empty palette cases, and oftentimes when you do, they're expensive. This one I found on Amazon and it was not too bad. And it fits a lot of paints from different manufacturers. Different sizes will fit in there just fine. I just recently purchased a set of the Yarka St. Petersburg. This is 36 full pans, and I'm really excited to try out some of these colors. and I was really surprised on Dick Blick that these were fairly reasonable. Although in all of these palettes I have quite a lot of colors, you really don't need a lot of different colors to start out. I would say start out with, if you build your own set, start out with a couple yellows, one that's cooler, one that's warmer, maybe an ochre for one and a lemon for another. Choose a couple reds, maybe a cooler red and a warmer red. A couple blues. I love Prussian blue and indigo. And those are great for mixing too. With just a couple blues, a couple yellows, and some red, you can mix so many colors. I had fun on these sketchbook pages trying to see how many different colors I could make. So there's lots of different greens and browns and rusts and variations of blues and purples, and it's such a fun activity if you're looking to experiment with your paints. I have a class on Skillshare about color mixing, and I'd also like to do a tutorial here on YouTube if you're interested, so just let me know. I think the one place that sets of colors often fall short is the greens that come with them. The greens, at least for botanical painting, the greens included in most sets are not very natural looking. I'll talk about a green next week that I really enjoy using. In general, for all of the colors that I use in my paintings, I mix the colors together on my palette. And here is my current state of my palette. I've been using this while creating my newest Skillshare class, mixing colors for some autumn botanicals. I love the really large wells in this palette. And I can show you a bit of how I work with my colors on my palette. So one of the other colors that you'll probably want to include in your collection if you want to do any florals is some sort of pink. So I'm starting out a mix here. I usually like to mix a few different colors together. Started out with some cobalt violet light and now quinacridone rose. I'm mixing those two together. And I wet my brush, rub it against the paint, and then rub it against my palette and mix the colors together. I added some Madder Lake red here, and then some quinacridone red. So let's test out this color. I like to test out on little scraps of paper and see how it looks. That looks nice, but I'm thinking maybe a little more intense. So I'm going to add some rose and see how that looks. Now that's a pretty beautiful color. I hope that gives you an idea of how I work with my watercolors. Next week, I'll be talking about my favorite color, green, from Yarka St. Petersburg, and I will have a special guest talking about and reviewing a new green that she is using by Daniel Smith. So until next time, I'm wishing you joy.